The prairie was quiet, except for the low whistle of the wind, moving across the barren stretch of land where sagebrush clung stubbornly to the soil. The sun was slipping down, painting the sky in streaks of amber and rose, and yet no one dared linger near the fresh mound of earth at the edge of town. A wooden cross, weathered and hastily carved, leaned just slightly to the left, its shadow stretching long as if it were pointing toward the woman who stood beside it. She wore black, her dress heavy with lace and sorrow, her veil lifting now and then with the restless breath of the desert evening. Folks called her the Mourning Widow, though few knew her story in full. They only knew that tragedy clung to her like a shroud, and that her presence at the graveyard kept even the boldest men at a respectful distance. She had buried her husband that morning under a sky the color of iron. Not a word was spoken as the coffin was lowered. Not a hand was offered to hold her steady as grief hollowed her frame. Men, who usually prided themselves on gallantry, kept their hats low, avoiding her gaze. Women whispered behind gloved fingers, pitying her sorrow but unwilling to step forward. She seemed untouchable, as though sorrow had wrapped her in a circle that no one dared to break. To approach her was to risk catching the same curse that had taken her husband too soon. So she stood alone, hour after hour, her hand resting lightly on the wooden cross, as if trying to anchor herself to the last remnant of love she had known. The town itself was no stranger to hardship. Life on the frontier was always marked by dust, blood, and long silences where prayers seemed to vanish into the endless horizon. Yet there was something about her sorrow that unsettled the people more than the harshest drought or fiercest storm. She had come to this place with her husband only 2 years past, riding in from the east with nothing but a wagon and hope. He had been a man of conviction, strong enough to carve a home out of stubborn earth, gentle enough to make even the hardest day bearable. Together, they had dreamed of a life where laughter could rise above the endless winds. But dreams die easy out here, and when his body was laid beneath the ground, the light seemed to drain from her eyes. No one in town dared say it aloud, but some believed she carried bad luck. First the fire that burned down their barn, then the sickness that took her husband in the span of a single week, then the storms that ruined half the crops for miles around. It was easier to call it misfortune than to face the cruelty of life. Yet even in whispers, the townsfolk agreed on one thing: the widow's sorrow was too heavy to bear, too raw to touch. So they kept their distance, watching from afar as she returned to the grave each morning, black skirts dragging in the dust, lips pressed tight as though she were holding back the sound of her breaking. That evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, a figure appeared on the ridge beyond the graveyard. Tall, steady, and dressed in buckskin, he came not with hesitation but with the purposeful stride of one who belonged to the land. The Comanche were known to ride those plains, fierce and proud, their presence both feared and respected. This man carried himself with the calm strength of someone who had seen much and feared little. His long hair moved with the wind, his dark eyes fixed on the woman at the grave. The townsfolk who had lingered by the edge of the road froze when they saw him approach. Some muttered warnings under their breath. Others took a cautious step back. They knew better than to interfere, for the Comanche did not walk into town affairs without reason. He did not glance their way, nor did he acknowledge their fear. His gaze remained fixed on the widow, so the rest of the world had faded into dust. She noticed him only when his shadow fell across the grave. Her breath caught, her fingers tightening on the wooden cross, as if it might shield her from whatever fate his presence carried. For a long moment, the silence deepened. Heavy as stone, the two of them bound by something unseen. The widow's grief stood like a wall, and yet he did not turn away. Instead, he stepped closer. Until he stood before her with the setting sun at his back, the people who watched from a distance held their breath. No one knew what he intended. Was it comfort he came to offer, or some claim that would stir fear in every heart? The widow lifted her eyes, and for the first time since the burial, her gaze met another's. His eyes did not carry pity, nor judgment, but something fiercer, something unbroken by grief or gossip. Then, with a quiet certainty that sent a shiver through the gathering dusk, he reached for her hand. His fingers closed gently but firmly around hers, steadying the tremor she could no longer hide. Gasps rose from the few onlookers. No one had dared approach her in her mourning, no one had dared risk stepping into the circle of her sorrow. Yet here was the Comanche, fearless and unflinching. Breaking the silence that had bound her to the grave, the widow did not pull away. Her breath trembled, and her eyes searched his face as though seeking an answer to a question she could not voice. The grave between them seemed to breathe with the weight of the moment. The desert wind paused, the last streaks of light clinging to the horizon as though the world itself held still, to see what would follow. And in that suspended silence, with the town watching from the shadows and the earth still fresh upon her husband's grave, the question remained, was this the beginning of her salvation, or the start of another storm that none of them could withstand? The widow's hand rested in his, her skin pale against the deep bronze of his fingers, and for a moment neither of them spoke. The grave between them still carried the smell of fresh earth, damp and unsettled. Behind them, the prairie stretched into shadows, the sun gone now, leaving only the faint glow of dying light. Those who had lingered in curiosity slowly slipped away, their boots crunching on gravel as they disappeared into the safety of their homes. Whispers would ripple through the town that night, voices hushed but urgent, carrying the story of what they had seen. No one had dared step near her, yet the Comanche had taken her hand as if no fear lived in him. She felt her breath falter as her eyes searched his face. His expression was unreadable, carved from something harder than stone, but his grip held no cruelty. It was steady, like a tether against the emptiness that had threatened to swallow her whole since the coffin was lowered. She had not expected anyone to come near, not after the way the townsfolk had avoided her all day, pretending their silence was respect when it was really fear. Now here he stood, a stranger yet not entirely foreign. For his people had moved across this land long before her husband had claimed a piece of it. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, carrying the rhythm of someone who spoke seldom but with weight. She could barely make sense of his words at first, as though the desert wind carried part of them away, but the meaning pressed through. He did not ask if she grieved. He did not offer the hollow comfort others had given her in passing days. Instead, he said that she must not remain at the grave through the night, that spirits did not rest when sorrow clung too heavy to the living. She wanted to speak, to tell him that she could not leave, not yet, that her heart was still tied to the earth beneath her feet, but the words caught in her throat. All she could manage was to meet his gaze, her eyes wet and fierce, unwilling to let go of the only place that still felt like her husband's presence lingered. He did not argue further, nor did he release her hand. His silence carried more strength than the chatter of the town ever could, and for reasons she could not name, she found herself listening to it. The night deepened. Coyotes called in the distance, their cries sharp against the emptiness, and the stars began to scatter themselves across the sky. He stood beside her still, unmoving, as if carved from the land itself. She wondered what had brought him here. Had he known her husband? Had he come to stake some claim, or to remind her of debts owed? Or was it something else, something unspoken that tied him to this grave at the edge of the desert? Her thoughts drifted back to the days before death had taken hold of her life. Her husband had often spoken of the Comanche, not with fear, but with a wary respect. He had said that these lands were not truly his to settle, that every plow he laid in the soil carried the weight of another man's history. Yet he had also believed in a future where people might live without the constant shadow of blood. She had admired that about him. Though she had never truly believed the land would let them live so easily, the sickness had come quickly, cruelly, leaving no time for remedies or prayers. One day he was strong, his voice steady as he split wood in the yard. The next he was pale and burning, his body broken under fever's hand. She had watched helplessly as life slipped from him, the dream they had built together, crumbling into dust. By the time the coffin was lowered into the ground, she felt as though she had been buried with him. Now, with the Comanche standing before her, she could not help but wonder if her husband's words about respect and unspoken ties had drawn this man here. His presence stirred unease, but also a strange sense of protection, though she dared not trust it yet. The town would not approve. Already she could imagine their whispers twisting the story, turning her grief into scandal. But none of that mattered in this moment. What mattered was that, for the first time since the coffin had been lowered, she did not feel completely alone. When she finally spoke, her voice was brittle, but steady enough to carry across the grave. She asked him why he had come. He studied her in silence for what felt like a long time, the stars reflected in his dark eyes. Then he said that grief left a mark that could be seen, even from far away, that sometimes it called to those who knew the weight of it. His words were simple, but they struck something deep inside her. She realized then that he had likely known loss, too, though his face betrayed nothing of it. Perhaps that was why his presence felt less like intrusion and more like recognition. The widow lowered her eyes to the grave again, her hand still held in his, and for the first time in many days, she let herself breathe without the sting of tears. The town behind them had gone quiet. Lamps dimmed, doors closed against the desert night. But the prairie was alive with its own voice, the soft brush of wind through sage, the low hum of crickets, the distant crack of a branch. It all pressed around them, reminding her that life did not pause for grief, that the land itself moved forward whether she wished it or not. The Comanche shifted slightly, his presence still steady, but his gaze turning toward the darkness beyond the graveyard. She followed his eyes and felt a shiver crawl across her skin. The horizon seemed endless, yet heavy with unseen weight. There was something in the night, something that had always been there but now seemed closer. He tightened his grip on her hand, not with force, but with certainty, as though reminding her that she was not alone in facing whatever waited in the shadows. The widow's chest ached with questions, but her tongue felt heavy with silence. She did not know if she could trust him, not yet, but the moment stretched between them with a fragile thread of connection. She sensed that his appearance at her side was not chance, that his reasons ran deeper than simple compassion. What lay ahead she could not tell. Whether he meant to shield her from more loss, or whether his hand carried her toward another kind of danger, the night gave no answer. Only the stars above bore witness, cold and unblinking. As the widow stood beside the grave, with the Comanche's hand holding hers, the future, still a shadow waiting to reveal itself. The morning after the graveyard encounter, the town was alive with murmurs. In the saloon, men leaned over their cups and spoke in half voices, glancing toward the door as if the widow herself might walk in. On the porch of the general store, women shook their heads, skirts brushing the dusty planks, whispering about the way the Comanche had dared to touch her hand in plain sight. What unsettled them most was not the fact that he had appeared, but that she had not pulled away. For a town bound by silence and suspicion, that single moment had cracked something fragile. By midday, every person carried an opinion. Some called it dangerous, saying she had invited trouble by not turning him aside. Others believed it shameful, claiming she had dishonored her husband's memory by letting another man near her so soon. A few, though quieter, admitted they felt something stirring in that moment at the grave, something they could not quite name. Still, no one dared voice support aloud. It was easier to hold fast to suspicion than to question their own fears. The widow remained in her house on the edge of town, shutters drawn against the blazing sun. She felt the eyes upon her even from behind the wooden walls. She knew the talk that ran through the streets like wildfire, but she did not care enough to give it breath. Her world had narrowed to the grave at the edge of the desert, and the strange man who had stood with her in silence. She told herself she should not think of him, that his presence was dangerous, yet her mind returned to his steady gaze. The way his words had carried weight without pity. Late that evening, when the sky stretched purple and gold again, she walked back to the grave. Dust clung to her black skirts, and the air was still with the heavy quiet that comes before nightfall. She half expected to see him there again, waiting. When she found only the cross leaning in the fading light, her chest ached with both relief and disappointment. She knelt beside the mound, whispering words meant only for the man beneath the earth, her voice trembling with the weight of the day. Unseen, the Comanche stood at a distance, watching. He did not approach this time. He understood the pull of grief and the need for solitude, but he also knew the world beyond the town was stirring. Signs on the land had not gone unnoticed, hoofprints too close to the water sources. The faint smell of smoke where no fire should be, the restless flight of birds in places they should have roosted. Trouble was moving, slow but certain. and it would not spare her simply because she was wrapped in sorrow. Back in town, the sheriff sat in his office, tapping his boot against the floorboards as he listened to the concerns of men who had crowded in. They wanted assurance that the Comanche's appearance meant nothing, that the widow would not bring danger to their door. The sheriff, a man grayed by years of watching over disputes that never truly ended, told them to keep their tempers steady. He warned that running a woman out in her grief would only stain the town's conscience. Still, he kept his doubts to himself. He had seen enough to know that fear could spark into fire with the smallest strike. Days passed. Each one waited with more tension than the last. The widow returned to the grave each evening, her black dress like a shadow against the desert's glow. Sometimes she felt the sense of being watched, though she saw no one. Once she caught the faint shape of a rider on the ridge, silhouetted against the sinking sun. She did not fear it. Some part of her already knew who it was, though she could not explain why his presence brought a strange steadiness to her. Chestnut, the townsfolk's whispers grew sharper. A boy delivering water swore he saw the Comanche riding near her house at dawn. A woman at the well claimed she had seen him leave a bundle of herbs by her gate. Whether the stories were true or twisted, they spread like kindling. The widow felt the weight of eyes upon her every time she walked into town for supplies, the air heavy with judgment that no one dared voice directly. One evening, as she returned from the grave, she found a small bundle resting on her porch. Inside were herbs she recognized from her husband's attempts to cure the fever roots and leaves that carried the sharp smell of earth. She knew without doubt who had left them. Her hand lingered over the bundle, her heart torn between gratitude and fear. To accept his gesture was to deepen a bond the town already watched with suspicion. To cast it aside felt like a denial of the only kindness she had been shown since her husband's death. She said it inside, her hands trembling. The conflict within her deepened each day. She owed her husband loyalty in death, yet she could not deny the quiet strength that seemed to surround the Comanche's presence. He did not seek to replace what she had lost. Instead, he seemed to recognize it, to acknowledge the wound without words. That recognition was more dangerous than any whispered gossip, for it stirred in her a sense that life might not end entirely in grief, and that, she feared, would make her an enemy in the eyes of the town. Meanwhile, far from the widow's home, a different tension stirred. Riders had been seen skirting the horizon, men who did not belong to the land but carried rifles across their saddles. They had no ties to the town, no respect for the Comanche, and no regard for a mourning woman at the edge of the desert. Their purpose was not yet clear, but the signs they left behind spoke of trouble. The Comanche knew this, and it was why he continued to watch, though from a distance. He did not intend to let the widow bear another loss without warning. The sheriff, too, noticed the unease building. He began making rounds more often, his eyes sharper, his hand closer to his revolver. He had lived long enough to recognize the sound of approaching conflict. It was in the way the men in town muttered about defending what was theirs, and in the way the horizon seemed to shift with shadows that did not belong. The widow, unaware of the full shape of danger gathering, fought her battles quietly. Each night at the grave, she spoke her heart to the man beneath the earth, confessing her doubts and fears. She felt torn between the memory of her husband's voice and the new, silent strength of the one who watched over her from the ridge. She knew the town would not forgive her if they saw her step too close to him. Yet the loneliness pressed on her like a weight she could no longer carry alone. One night, as she lingered at the grave longer than usual, the Comanche appeared again. He did not step into the circle of the cross this time, but stopped a short distance away, his figure dark against the silver glow of the moon. She rose slowly, her breath catching at the sight of him. He did not speak at first, only nodded toward the horizon, where the faint glow of fire flickered against the night sky. Her eyes widened as she realized it was too far from town to be a homestead fire, too wild to be anything but a camp of strangers. Fear pricked at her skin. But before she could speak, he told her she must be ready, that the land was restless, and that the storm ahead would test every soul who called it home. His voice carried no panic, only certainty, yet it chilled her more than any whisper she had heard in town. She clutched her shawl tighter around her shoulders. Her eyes drifting to the distant glow, the Comanche's gaze lingered on her, his expression unreadable. Then he turned back toward the dark horizon, as if already preparing for what would come. The widow stood frozen, caught between the safety of returning to her home and the unshakable sense that her life was already being drawn into a conflict far larger than her own. Grief, the fire on the horizon, burned low by morning, but the questions it left in her heart did not fade. She knew now that the grave was no longer just a place of mourning. It had become the center of something unseen, a turning point she could not yet understand. And as the town stirred to another day of whispers, the widow felt the first true weight of what it meant to stand between sorrow and the storm that was coming. The days that followed carried a weight heavier than grief. The widow could feel it in the way the town breathed, in the sharp looks passed over barrels and through lace curtains. The riders out on the horizon had not vanished. Their fires glowed faintly at night, and though distant, they seemed to creep closer with each passing evening. The sheriff tried to calm his people, saying no one knew the riders' true purpose, but his words rang hollow. Fear had already rooted itself, and fear did not release its hold easily. The widow could not escape the talk. When she walked into town for flour, the whispers followed her like shadows. When she lingered at the grave, she felt eyes watching from the ridge. Some part of her wanted to bar her door and hide, but she knew hiding was no longer enough. The Comanche's warning about the restless land echoed in her mind, and the sight of the fire that night would not leave her. She told herself she should stay away from him, yet each evening she found herself searching the horizon for his figure. And each time, when she saw him there, her chest tightened with both fear and a strange, unspoken relief. One afternoon, the widow overheard two men outside the store. They spoke low, but their words carried enough for her to understand. They said the riders were scouting, waiting for a moment when the town was unguarded. They also said the widow's Comanche friend might be working with them, using her grief as a shield to move freely. Their suspicion stung sharper than any insult, because it was wrapped in half-truths she could not prove wrong. She wanted to cry out that they were wrong, but she held her tongue. Defending him openly would only feed their doubts. The sheriff paid her a visit that evening. His face was lined with worry, his hat in his hands. He asked if she had seen the Comanche again, his voice even, but his eyes sharp. She told him only that she had seen a figure on the ridge. She could not bring herself to speak more, not knowing if trust would betray her. The sheriff warned her to be cautious, that people were restless and looking for someone to blame. His words lingered after he left, heavier than before. She understood then that her life was no longer her own to carry quietly. Every step she took was being weighed by the eyes of the town, and one wrong move might tip them into anger. The Comanche came to her house at dusk. She found him waiting by the porch, his horse tethered at the post. His presence was calm, but his eyes carried the same weight she had seen in the sheriff's. He told her the riders were growing bolder, their tracks leading closer to the water that fed both the town and the grazing land. He said they were not his people, but others, drifters and outlaws, who thrived on fear. His words shook her. She wanted to believe the sheriff would protect the town, but she knew the town was too small, too fragile. She asked him why he cared to warn her, why he stayed near when the town despised his presence. He answered simply that sorrow had called him, and once called, it could not be ignored. His words were steady, yet behind them she sensed Maratai she could not name, something binding him to her fate as much as his own. She felt the pull of his gaze, the raw truth of it, and for the first time she admitted to herself that she wanted him to stay. That night, the rider's fire burned brighter, closer. From her window, she could see the glow pulsing against the horizon. She thought of the sheriff's warning, of the townsfolk's whispers, of the Comanche's steady voice. Sleep did not come. She sat by the window until dawn, her shawl wrapped tight, her eyes never leaving that burning edge of the world. The next day the town erupted. A rancher rode in from the north, his face pale with dust and fear. He claimed the riders had driven off cattle, that they were marking their presence with gunfire in the night. The saloon filled with men shouting for action. Some demanded the sheriff form a posse and strike before the riders could gather more strength. Others wanted to wait, to guard the town rather than meet trouble head-on. Beneath their arguments, one name rose again, and again the Comanche. Some swore he had been seen near the herds, that his horse tracks matched those around the stolen cattle. It did not matter that no proof stood behind their claims. Fear made proof unnecessary. By sundown, the air in town felt like it could split. The widow heard their anger even from her porch. She wanted to scream that they were blind, that he was the only one who saw the truth. But she knew her words would only fan the flames higher. Instead, she walked to the grave once more, her feet dragging through dust. The Comanche was already there, standing with his arms crossed, as though the land itself had summoned him. She told him what the town was saying, her voice trembling with both anger and dread. He listened without interruption, his face calm but unreadable. When she finished, he said nothing for a long while. Then he told her that truth often died first when fear took hold, and that she must be ready for the storm that would follow. She asked him if he would leave, if distance might spare her from suspicion, but he shook his head. He said the riders would come whether he stayed or not. And leaving her would not stop their fire. The widow's chest tightened as she realized the path ahead. The town would not forgive her if she stood by him, yet she could not bear to watch him face the danger alone. Her husband's memory pressed on her heart, but so did the living presence of the man before her. She stood between the past and the future, between the grave and the fire on the horizon. That night, thunder rolled in the distance, though no storm cloud crossed the sky. It was the sound of hooves, faint but steady, carried across the desert air. The widow stood at her window again, listening, her breath caught in her throat. The riders were moving closer now, no longer content to linger in the shadows. The glow of fire pulsed brighter, flickering like the breath of something alive in town. Lamps burned late as men gathered in the saloon, their voices raised, their tempers high. The sheriff tried to calm them, but his words were drowned by anger. Some demanded the widow be questioned, that she confess what ties she held with the Comanche. Others wanted to march out to meet the riders before dawn. The air reeked of gun oil and whiskey, of fear sharpened into rage. On the ridge, the Comanche watched. His eyes swept the horizon, his hand resting on the hilt of the knife at his belt. He could feel the land shifting, the weight of violence pressing near. He knew the town's fear would soon break against the fire of the riders, and in that clash, no soul would be spared the cost. Yet his gaze drifted again and again to the small house at the edge of the desert, to the light burning faint in the widow's window. The widow stood inside, her hands pressed to the wooden frame, her heart pounding with a rhythm she could not quiet. She thought of the grave, of her husband's voice, of the way the Comanche had spoken of grief like a bond that could not be severed. She felt the world closing in, every path narrowing toward a moment she could neither stop nor turn from. The riders were coming. The town was restless. The sheriff was stretched thin. And between it all stood the widow, her sorrow now bound to something larger than herself. She knew the night ahead would bring more than whispers, more than fear. It would bring fire, steel, and the test of every bond left unbroken. The horizon flickered again, brighter this time, the flames rising like a warning. The widow's breath hitched as she realized the moment was no longer far away. The storm was here, pressing down upon the land, and every step forward carried her closer to the edge where grief, suspicion, and fire would collide. The riders came at night. Their hooves beat like thunder over the dry earth, a storm rolling in without rain. The town woke to the sound, men rushing from their homes with rifles clutched in shaking hands, women pulling children close and barring doors. The saloon emptied into the street, the sheriff shouting over the chaos, his voice raw but firm. Fire lit the horizon, then spread as torches swung high in the air. Fear that had lived in whispers now roared loud enough to shake every wall. The widow stood at her window, frozen, watching the glow grow brighter. Her breath came short as she heard the Comanche's words in her mind, warning her of this very night. She wanted to run, to hide, but she knew there was no safety left in her small house at the edge of the desert. Gathering her shawl, she stepped outside. The wind carrying sparks already drifting in the air. On the ridge, the Comanche rode hard, his horse cutting down the slope with precision born of years on the land. He had seen the riders gather, seen their torches flare, and he knew the town would not stand long without guidance. His people had fought such men before, outlaws, who lived only to take and burn, and he carried their memory in his scars. Yet tonight was not about the riders alone. Tonight, the weight of grief, suspicion, and fear all collided in one place. The sheriff met him in the street as the first shots cracked across the night. The men of the town were unsteady, their courage fueled by anger more than skill. The Comanche shouted for them to hold the line by the well, to guard the water, for without it the riders would burn the town to ash. Some hesitated, not trusting him, but the sheriff barked for them to listen. In that moment, the line between friend and stranger blurred under the heat of fire and steel. The widow moved through the chaos, her heart pounding as she searched for the grave at the edge of the cemetery. Smoke stung her eyes, but she pressed on. She could not let the place where her husband lay be trampled by flames or hooves. She reached the mound and dropped to her knees, her hands clutching the earth, whispering words to the man she had loved. She asked him for strength, for forgiveness, for the courage to stand in a world that had taken him from her. Behind her, the sounds of battle tore through the night. But she held fast, her grief no longer weakness but anchor. The riders crashed into the town, wild and ruthless. Some swung rifles, others carried knives, their shouts piercing the dark. The men of the town fired back, shots sparking off stone, cries of pain mixing with curses. For every rider that fell, another seemed to push forward, pressing harder against the thin line of defense. Yet the Comanche moved through them with purpose, his blade flashing, his horse cutting paths where the townsfolk faltered. He fought not for glory, but to keep the fire from consuming all. The sheriff fought at his side, his revolver steady despite the years on his hands. They guarded the well together, forcing the riders back again and again. Each glance exchanged between them carried understanding. Whatever fear the town had carried before, tonight they stood as men bound by survival, not suspicion. The widow rose from the grave, her body trembling, but her resolve clear. She turned toward the town, the flames painting her face in gold and shadow. She could not fight with steel, but she could carry water. She could tend wounds. She could steady hands shaking with fear. She moved among the people, guiding children to safety, pressing cloth to bleeding shoulders, offering words of comfort that cut through panic. Her presence steadied them, reminded them they were more than fear. The battle stretched through hours that felt like years. Hooves pounded, guns roared, the night thick with smoke and fire. Slowly, the riders faltered. Their torches dimmed, their numbers thinned under the weight of resistance they had not expected. The Comanche drove them back beyond the ridge, his final strike cutting through the night as the last of their torches fell dark against the sand. Silence followed, broken only by the ragged breathing of the town and the crackle of dying flames. When dawn broke, the town stood scarred but unbroken. Ash marked the streets, blood stained the dirt, but the well still stood. The home still rose against the sky. The sheriff walked among his people, his hat low, his voice quiet as he called for calm. The men lowered their guns, the women opened their doors. Slowly life returned from the edge of ruin. The widow stood at the edge of the street, her eyes searching for the Comanche. He sat upon his horse, dust and blood marking him, his face unreadable, yet steady as ever. The townsfolk looked at him differently now, their suspicion tempered by the truth they could not deny. Without him, they would not have stood through the night. No one said it aloud, but in their silence lay a kind of respect that had never existed before. She stepped toward him, her heart torn between gratitude and the weight of all that had passed. He looked at her only once, their eyes meeting in a silence deeper than words. She wanted to speak, to ask what would become of him, of them, of the bond forged in sorrow and fire. But he turned his horse slowly, guiding it toward the horizon. He had come when sorrow called, and now, with the dawn, his path led elsewhere. The widow felt the ache of his leaving. She also felt something else's strength she had not known she carried. The grave still stood, her husband's memory still heavy, but she no longer bore it alone. In the night's trial, she had found a place between grief and life, between memory and the promise of what still remained. The sheriff approached her, his voice rough but kind. He told her the town would remember what she had done, how she had stood when fear could have broken them. She nodded, her eyes on the ridge where the Comanche had disappeared. She did not answer, for some truths did not need words. The days that followed brought rebuilding. The townsfolk patched roofs, mended fences, and buried the few they had lost. The widow helped where she could, her hands steady, her presence no longer marked by whispers, but by quiet gratitude. Children no longer stared at her with fear. Women no longer crossed the street to avoid her. She had become part of the town again, though a part marked forever by the night of fire. At the grave, she still knelt each evening, her voice low as she spoke to the man she had loved. She told him of the riders, of the flames, of the Comanche who had stood beside them when no one else would. She told him of her sorrow, but also of the strength she had found, a strength he had once believed in for her. She did not know if her words reached him. Speaking them kept his presence alive within her. The horizon remained wide, the desert endless, but she no longer feared it. Somewhere out there, the Comanche rode on, carrying his own grief, his own silence. She did not know if their paths would cross again. But she carried him now as part of her story, surely as she carried the man beneath the earth. In time, the town would grow quiet again. The scars of the fire would fade. The whispers would turn to stories told on porches. Tales of the night when fear nearly broke them. But for the widow, the memory would remain sharper than any story. She had seen sorrow turn to strength, seen strangers become protectors, seen the edge of despair bend into dawn. When she stood at the grave under the setting sun, the wind brushing her hair, she no longer felt alone. The land still carried its weight, the future still held its shadows, but she had found a way to walk forward. Grief would never leave her, but it no longer bound her. And as the stars rose again over the desert, she lifted her head to the sky. Knowing the night had not defeated her, the widow's story became one of endurance, of quiet courage that did not bow to fear. The town, once bound by suspicion, had learned the cost of mistrust and the strength that comes from standing together. And somewhere beyond the horizon, the Comanche rode on, his silence carrying the memory of a night when he had reached across grief to hold a hand at a grave, and in doing so, had changed more than one life. Top of form, bottom of form,